If I commissioned every painting in this gallery, would you finally look at me? The billionaire said. But the artist's answer made the entire room go quiet. Before we start, drop a comment telling us which city you're watching from. And at the end, don't forget to rate the story from 0 to 10. Enjoy. Donovan Hale had not intended to stop. He was cutting through the Distillery District on his way back from a lunch meeting that had run 40 minutes over schedule, his jacket slung over one arm, his phone already buzzing with the 3 follow-up messages his assistant had preemptively sent before he'd even left the restaurant. The cobblestones were wet from an early October rain, and the crowds of tourists had thinned to a manageable few. And Donovan was, in every possible way, a man with somewhere else to be. Then he walked past the open door of a narrow gallery and stopped walking entirely. It wasn't the paintings that stopped him. It was the painter. She was standing on a low wooden step stool in front of a half-finished canvas, her back to the door, her dark hair pulled up with what appeared to be a pencil, and 2 clips that weren't quite doing their job. She wore paint-spattered overalls over a cream-colored shirt, and she was arguing quietly with the canvas. Not with anyone in the room, just with the canvas itself, tilting her head and muttering something too low to catch. Donovan didn't go in. He stood in the doorway for a moment longer than he should have, then kept walking. He came back 20 minutes later. He told himself it was because he'd remembered seeing a press mention of this particular gallery. Something about emerging artists in the Globe's weekend section. He was, after all, a man who kept track of cultural investments. It was professional curiosity, entirely professional. The painter was still there. Now she was wiping her hands on a rag that was doing approximately nothing useful, surveying the canvas with the focused dissatisfaction of someone who had a very clear picture in her head and was not yet satisfied with what existed outside of it. A man near the entrance, the gallery owner, it turned out, a wiry fellow named Graham, moved to greet Donovan immediately. Donovan had that effect on rooms. People straightened when he entered, voices adjusted. It had been happening since he was 26 and made his first significant deal, and he had long since stopped noticing it. The painter did not straighten. She did not look up. "Marguerite," Graham said. "We have a visitor." "I see that," she said, still not turning around. "I'm finishing a glaze layer. If he's here for the Kowalczyk piece, tell him it sold Tuesday." Donovan blinked. He was not accustomed to being referred to in the third person by someone who hadn't yet looked at him. "I'm not here for a specific piece," he said. She turned then, not quickly, not with the startled adjustment people usually made when they realized who he was, but at her own pace, the way someone turns when they've decided the interruption is worth acknowledging. She looked at him once, clearly, and whatever she concluded from that single look, she kept to herself. "Then what are you here for?" "I'm not entirely sure yet," Donovan said. It was, he realized, possibly the most honest thing he had said in the last 6 months. Marguerite Osei studied him for a moment with calm brown eyes, the kind of eyes that seemed to be doing a great deal more thinking than they were advertising. Then she nodded once, the way people nod when they've heard something reasonable but remain unconvinced, and turned back to her canvas. "Take your time," she said. "Graham can answer questions. There's a price list by the door." Donovan looked at the price list. He looked at the paintings. He spent 45 minutes in that gallery, which was 43 minutes longer than he had planned to spend anywhere that afternoon. He bought nothing. He came back the next day. He told himself, and this was the kind of telling himself that doesn't really convince anyone, that the Osei collection was a legitimate investment opportunity. The paintings were striking, genuinely striking, with a quality of color and composition that suggested someone who had studied seriously, and then decided the rules were suggestions. Marguerite Osei had done her MFA at OCAD, had shown work in Montreal and Vancouver, and had exactly the kind of trajectory that made a collector look smart 5 years later. That was what he told himself. On the third day, he came back and bought something. A small piece, a study of Lake Ontario in November fog, maybe 30 centimeters square. He chose it for reasons he refused to examine closely. Marguerite packed it in brown paper herself slowly while Donovan stood at the counter. "You were here Tuesday," she said. "And Wednesday, I know." She smoothed a fold in the paper. "Graham mentioned it. He was hoping you were about to buy the large triptych. He's been trying to move it since spring. It's not right for my space. Where's your space?" "Yorkville." She nodded, as if this confirmed something she had already suspected. "What do you do?" Donovan paused. He did that sometimes now, paused before answering, because the answer usually changed the conversation in ways he had grown tired of. Development, he said. Real estate and development. For yourself or for someone else? For myself. She looked up then. Not with recognition, not with the particular recalibration that happened when people connected his face to his name, just with a look of mild assessment. That's a vague answer. It's an accurate one. They're not always the same thing. She handed him the wrapped painting. Their fingers didn't touch. Donovan became aware that he had been hoping they would, which was a thought he set aside immediately. "Will you be back?" she asked. Not warmly, not coldly, just the question, unadorned. "Probably," Donovan said. "There are 43 other galleries in the Distillery District." "I know." She looked at him for one more moment, and then the corner of her mouth moved, not quite a smile, something more precise than a smile, an acknowledgement of a point scored, and she went back to her canvas. Donovan walked out into the October air, holding a 30-centimeter painting, and the strange, unsettling certainty that he had just lost some kind of opening exchange without being sure what game was being played. He came back the following Tuesday, and the Tuesday after that. He learned, over the course of those visits, that Marguerite Osei had grown up in Brampton, had spent 3 years teaching art in community centers before her first serious show, and woke up every morning at 5:30 to paint before the light changed. He learned that she was 31, that she took her coffee with exactly 1 sugar, and that she found his habit of checking his phone during conversations, a habit he had not realized he had, somewhere between rude and diagnostic. He learned that she did not find him particularly impressive. This was a new experience. "You keep showing up," she said one afternoon, when November had brought the gray skies of a serious Canadian autumn, and the tourists had mostly disappeared, and the district had settled into its quieter winter self. "But you haven't bought anything else." "I bought the November study. That was 3 weeks ago. I'm considering the small coastal series." "You've been considering it for 2 weeks." She was mixing paint at the long work table, focused on her palette the way she focused on everything, entirely, as if the thing in front of her were the only thing that existed. "Either you like it or you don't." "I'm still deciding." She set down her palette knife and looked at him with an expression that somehow conveyed, without any particular unkindness, that she had a limited supply of patience and was choosing to spend some of it on this conversation. "What are you actually doing here, Donovan?" It was the first time she had used his first name. He was aware of this in a way that was entirely disproportionate to the event. "I like the gallery," he said. "You like the gallery," she repeated, with the tone of someone transcribing an explanation for future reference. "You have canceled 2 meetings this week to be in this gallery, Graham told me." She tilted her head. "I looked you up." Donovan felt something happen in his chest, a small contraction, the specific unease of knowing someone now knew what he actually was, and Donovan Hale, 41. Principal of Hale Capital Properties, listed as one of Toronto's 50 most influential people 2 years running. She resumed mixing her paint, unhurried. "You could be anywhere. You own a building 3 blocks from here. So the gallery explanation is technically accurate, and probably not the whole story." Donovan said nothing. "That's fine," Marguerite said. "You don't have to explain yourself, but if you're planning to keep taking up space at my work table, I'm going to need you to actually be useful or actually be honest. I have a show opening in 6 weeks and I'm behind." "I could be useful," Donovan said before he had time to think about whether this was true. She handed him a wide, flat brush. "Then start priming. The small canvases in the back, 3 coats. Don't leave brush marks." Donovan Hale, whose company currently managed $400 million in assets, spent the next 2 hours priming canvases in a small Toronto gallery, listening to Marguerite Osei work, and feeling, to his own considerable bewilderment, entirely fine about it. Then a woman walked in. She was attractive in an extremely composed way, wearing a camel coat that Donovan recognized as very expensive, and she looked between Marguerite and Donovan with a smile that had done its calculations. Marguerite. The woman's name was Sloane. Sloane Waverly, as it turned out, arts journalist, freelance cultural consultant, and, from what Donovan had heard in passing through various boardrooms, someone who had recently begun attaching herself to wealthy collectors in ways that were professionally convenient. "I heard you had an interested buyer." "I have several," Marguerite said without looking up. Sloane's gaze settled on Donovan with a kind of precision. Donovan Hale. This is unexpected. Most things are, Donovan said. I've been meaning to call your assistant. The Meridian Project. I have some thoughts about the cultural programming element that I think you'd find compelling. Donovan was aware, without looking, of Marguerite going very still beside him. He understood exactly what Sloane's presence was communicating. And he understood that Marguerite was now recalibrating everything she had observed about him in the last 3 weeks through this new information. He didn't like it. Not because of Sloane. Sloane was a complication he knew how to handle, but because of what Marguerite's stillness told him. Call my assistant, Donovan said to Sloane. Schedule something through the office. He set down the priming brush and turned to Marguerite. I should let you work. I'll be back Thursday. Marguerite looked at him. Her expression was even, and he could not read it, and he had the unsettling realization that he had become very interested in learning to read it. Thursday, she said. That was all. Donovan left. Across the street, a man in a dark jacket who had been standing near the coffee window for an unusually long time watched him go, then made a phone call. Donovan didn't notice. He was thinking about something Marguerite had said 3 weeks earlier, when he'd asked about a piece on the back wall. A woman standing at the edge of something, her back to the viewer. Is it finished? He'd asked. No, she'd said. But it might be the most honest thing I've made in years. He thought about that on the walk back to his office. He thought about it more than he thought about the Meridian Project, the afternoon's missed calls, or any of the things that, 2 months ago, would have occupied the entirety of his mind. He had 4 missed calls from his business partner, Callum Reed. He called back from the elevator. Where have you been? Callum said. Fletcher's been trying to reach you since noon. I was in a meeting in the Distillery District. Callum's voice had the cautious quality of someone choosing words carefully. The gallery meeting. Donovan said nothing. Donovan, Fletcher came by the office today. He's telling people you're losing focus. That you missed the Brixton refinancing call. I delegated the Brixton call. You didn't tell anyone you were delegating it. It just didn't happen. A pause. What's going on? Nothing is going on. Is it the Osei woman? The elevator reached Donovan's floor. He stepped out. Her name is Marguerite Osei. She's an artist. I've purchased 1 piece from her gallery. Fletcher says. Fletcher is my partner's assistant and should be focused on his own responsibilities. Donovan's voice went flat in the way it did when conversations were over. I'll call him in the morning. He hung up. He stood in the hallway of his office for a moment, listening to the building hum quietly around him. Fletcher Drummond was Callum's deputy and had been angling for a senior partnership role for 2 years. Donovan had never quite trusted him. The feeling was one of those things you filed in the back of your mind and forgot about, until you didn't. He sent Callum a message. Let's have breakfast tomorrow, 7 a.m. Then he sat down at his desk and tried to focus on the 18 things that required his attention, and managed to think about 15 of them, which he'd considered a reasonable approximation of success. Thursday arrived. Marguerite was alone in the gallery when he got there, standing in front of the unfinished piece, the woman at the edge. She didn't turn around. Sloane Waverley has been coming to this gallery for 2 years, Marguerite said, still looking at the painting. She once offered to write a feature on my work in exchange for a discount on a large piece. That sounds like her. Is she someone you're involved with? No, were you? Donovan paused. Briefly, a year ago. It ended cleanly. Marguerite turned around. She looked at him the way she looked at paintings, not unkindly but with full attention, as if she was deciding what she actually saw rather than what she expected to see. Why are you here? Not the gallery. Here, specifically, every Tuesday and Thursday, sometimes Wednesday, helping prime canvases, staying late enough that Graham starts locking up around you. Donovan looked at the unfinished piece on the wall, the woman standing at the edge of something, her back to everyone. Can I ask you something first? You can try. Who is she, in the painting? A pause. My mother, Marguerite said. She was a textile artist. She died when I was 19, right before she finished the piece she considered her best work. I've been trying to paint her for 12 years. I haven't gotten it right yet. She said it without self-pity, as a fact. Your turn. Donovan put his hands in his pockets, which was something he did when he was about to say something he hadn't prepared. I've spent 18 years building things, he said. Buildings, portfolios, a particular kind of life. I'm good at it. I'm very good at it. And somewhere in the last couple of years, I started feeling like I was running a very efficient machine that I didn't particularly like being inside. He looked at her. I walked past this gallery on a Wednesday afternoon in October, and I saw you arguing with a canvas, and I thought, this person knows exactly what she wants and hasn't found it yet, and somehow that was the most interesting thing I'd seen all year. The silence that followed had weight. That's very honest, Marguerite said finally. You said you needed honest or useful. I was more useful when I was priming. The corner of her mouth moved again, that precise, considered almost smile. You can prime again on Saturday. I'll be here early. She picked up a brush. The conversation, apparently, was over. But something in the gallery had shifted quietly. The way light shifts in the late afternoon and you don't notice until you realize the room looks different than it did an hour ago. Donovan left with his heart doing something he hadn't authorized, which was a sensation he filed away for later examination. Saturday, as agreed. Then the following Wednesday. Then 2 Saturdays in a row because the show was 6 weeks out, and Marguerite was, by her own assessment, nowhere near ready. During those weeks, Donovan learned more about her. She had spent a year in her early 20s working in her aunt's dry cleaning shop in Brampton to save money for her MFA. She listened to old Fela Kuti records while she painted. She had an almost alarming memory for color. She could look at something once and reproduce the exact shade 3 weeks later without reference. She had been engaged, briefly, at 27, to a man named Reeves who had, in her words, wanted the version of me that was easier to understand. She had not seemed particularly devastated by this, but Donovan noted it in the way you note information that might matter later. He also, during those weeks, began to notice things about his own company. It started with small inconsistencies in the Meridian project numbers. Nothing obvious, nothing that would catch someone's eye on a first pass. But Donovan had built Hale Capital from a single leveraged property in his early 20s, and he had learned to read spreadsheets the way Marguerite read a canvas. Not for what they said, but for what was slightly off. Fletcher's name appeared on revision histories at odd hours. Emails to an external consultant were seeded to an address Donovan didn't recognize. 2 client meetings had been quietly rescheduled without Donovan's knowledge, both with clients who had recent cold spells in their dealings with the firm. He sat with this information for a week before doing anything with it. Meanwhile, the situation with Marguerite. She had let him help hang pieces for the upcoming show. A trust Donovan understood was not extended casually, given the spectacular disaster that had occurred when he'd tried to adjust one hanging wire and slightly dented a frame, which Marguerite had observed with the expression of a person mentally revising their risk assessments. I'll fix it, Donovan said. I know, which is why I'm not panicking. You should see what Callum did to the Keene piece at the Foundation Gala last year. Donovan stared at her. You know Callum? He's been on the gallery's donor board for 2 years. A pause. You didn't know that? No, she studied him. Does that bother you? I'm not sure. Donovan set down the hanging wire carefully. Callum has never mentioned you. I've never mentioned him to you either. We don't exactly overlap. You do now, she tilted her head. Is that a problem? He looked at her standing in the middle of the half-hung gallery, her hair pinned back with the usual pencil, wearing her paint-spattered overalls, calm and self-contained, and exactly who she was in every situation, and he thought, no, it's the opposite of a problem, and I am deeply, inconveniently aware of that. No, he said. He went back to the hanging wire. He was getting better at it. That same week, Sloane Waverly came back to the gallery. Marguerite was out. She'd gone to pick up a framing order, and Donovan was alone, reviewing a measurements list, when Sloane walked in wearing that precise camel coat and a smile that had learned to account for variables. I had a feeling you'd be here, she said. The gallery's open to the public. Donovan. She sat on the small bench near the entrance the way people sit when they intend to stay for a while. I'm going to say something that's going to sound interfering, I know that, but I've known you long enough to say it anyway. Go ahead. Fletcher came to me last week. He wanted background on Marguerite, the kind of background that's designed to shape a narrative. Donovan went very still. What kind of narrative? The kind where an artist with a community center background and no significant commercial track record seems like an unusual distraction for a man in your position. The kind where spending time in a small gallery in the Distillery District starts to look like poor judgment. And you told him? I told him I didn't have anything useful. She met his eyes. Which is true. But I also want you to know he's shopping the story somewhere. I don't know where yet. Donovan set down the measurements list. Why are you telling me this? Sloane was quiet for a moment. Because whatever happened between us, it happened cleanly, like you said. And I still have a functional conscience. She stood, straightened her coat. Also, for what it's worth, she's good. The work is genuinely good. Whatever else is complicated, that part isn't. She left. Donovan stood in the middle of the gallery for a long moment. When Marguerite came back with the framing order, she found him on his phone, speaking in the low, focused voice he used when things had become serious. She set down the frames and waited. When he hung up, she said, "What happened?" He looked at her, directly, without the editing he'd been doing for the last several weeks, the careful management of how much to say. "Someone in my company is trying to make your connection to me into a problem. A professional liability. Fletcher Drummond has been collecting information about you." Marguerite set down her coffee cup. "Me specifically. You specifically." She was quiet for a moment. Then, why? Because I've been distracted. Because distracted looks like vulnerability to people who've been waiting for an opening. He paused. And because this. He stopped. Tried again. Because what's happening here is visible enough that people are using it as a vector. What is happening here, Donovan? The question sat in the middle of the gallery, unhurried, waiting. Donovan thought about 18 years of efficient machines. He thought about the November painting he'd hung in his Yorkville kitchen, where he could see it every morning. He thought about the way Marguerite looked at the unfinished painting of her mother with the specific grief of someone who was still trying to get something exactly right. "I don't entirely know yet," he said, "but I know it matters." Marguerite looked at him for a long moment. "Fletcher," she said, "that name. He was at the Foundation Gala. He was talking to Callum." Donovan sat down. "Show me everything you have," Marguerite said, pulling up a stool. "From the beginning." They spent the next 3 hours at the gallery work table going through what Donovan had, the revision histories, the rescheduled meetings, the external email address. Marguerite was quiet and precise, and asked the kinds of questions that clarified rather than complicated. At one point she pulled up something on her own laptop, a comment thread on a small arts and culture website, where an unsigned post had described a prominent Toronto real estate developer as losing his edge and distracted by a gallery hobby. It had gone up 4 days ago. "Is that you?" she asked. "Almost certainly. And this is meant to damage you, or set up for something larger." Donovan rubbed a hand across his forehead. "Callum wouldn't do this on his own. He doesn't have the ambition for it. Fletcher has been pushing for a senior partnership vote for 2 years. If he can make the case to the board that I'm losing focus, then there's an opening." "Yes." Marguerite closed her laptop. She looked at the painting on the wall, her mother, still unfinished. Then she looked at Donovan with the clean, clear attention he had first noticed on a rainy October afternoon. "What do you need?" she asked. "I need evidence of direct interference before the quarterly board meeting. That's in 11 days. Can you get it? If I know where to look." He paused. "The external email address connects to a consulting company that doesn't appear to have a web presence. I need someone to trace it." "I know someone," Marguerite said. "An old friend from the community center years. She does cybersecurity now. You know, a cybersecurity expert. She's very good and she owes me several favors, none of which involve anything illegal." A pause. "Mostly." Despite everything, Donovan laughed. It surprised him. The laugh came out unplanned, unguarded. Marguerite looked at him with something that might have been, for the first time, genuine warmth. "Call her," Donovan said. The next 11 days were the most clarifying of Donovan's recent life. His friend from the community center, her name was Adiese, and she was in fact very good, traced the consulting company to a shell registered in Nova Scotia, funded by a holding company that shared an address with a private investment fund. The fund had one silent partner, a real estate developer named Garrison, who had been trying to acquire a parcel in the Meridian project for 3 years, and had been quietly blocked each time. Fletcher had been feeding Garrison information about Donovan's schedule, his client relationships, his recent distractions, in exchange for a promised associate partnership. Once Garrison's team had enough leverage to push for a restructuring of Hale Capital's leadership. It was, Marguerite said, the least creative corporate plot she had ever heard described. They always think it's more complicated than it is, she said. They were at his kitchen table at midnight, coffee cups and documents spread between them, and she was reviewing the last of Daisy's findings with the unhurried attention she brought to everything. The whole thing hinges on making you look distracted, which only works if you don't notice it happening. I almost didn't. She looked up. But you did. You helped. You started looking before you told me anything. She set down the document. Donovan, you're not actually losing your edge. You were just paying attention to something different for a while. He looked at her across his kitchen table, in the quiet of his Yorkville apartment, with the November painting on the wall behind her. Something different, he repeated. That's one way to describe it. Marguerite held his gaze for a moment. Then she picked up her coffee. Tell me what you need for the board meeting. The board meeting was at 8 in the morning on a Thursday. Donovan arrived with a folder he had spent 3 days preparing, clear, documented, precisely organized. Callum arrived looking uncertain, which told Donovan that Callum had known something was happening, without fully understanding what. Fletcher arrived last, confident in the way people are confident when they've planned carefully and don't know the plan has been visible for weeks. Donovan waited until the standard agenda items had been covered before he set the folder on the table and said, "Before we discuss the Meridian timeline, I'd like to address something directly." The presentation took 20 minutes. Donovan had been in boardrooms for 18 years and knew that clarity and brevity were more effective than drama, so he was clear and brief. The interference, the external communications, the shell company, the connection to Garrison, the specific ways internal information had been selectively shared to create an appearance of negligence where none existed. Fletcher's face went through 3 distinct phases. Donovan recognized all of them. "This is," Fletcher started. "Documented," Donovan said. "All of it. Our legal team has had it since yesterday." Callum had not spoken during the presentation. Now he said quietly, "Fletcher, just the name. The weight in it was enough." Fletcher left the meeting before the vote. The vote, when it happened, was brief. Afterward, Donovan stood at the window of the boardroom with its view of the Toronto skyline and felt the particular relief of something complicated becoming clear. His phone buzzed. A message from Marguerite. "How did it go?" He typed back, "Done. Cleanly." 3 dots appeared. Then, "Good. I finished the painting." Donovan stared at that message for a moment. He knew which painting she meant. "I'm coming by," he typed. "The gallery's closed, I know." A pause. Then, "The side door is unlocked." He took a cab. The Distillery District was quiet in the early November morning, the cobblestones still damp, the lights on and a few kitchen windows above the shops. The gallery side door was unlocked, as promised. Marguerite was standing in front of the finished painting. It was extraordinary. That was the only word. The woman at the edge, her mother, was no longer just standing there. She had been given something in the final sessions, some quality of presence that made her feel like someone in the middle of a decision rather than the end of one. The edge she stood at was no longer an ending. It was a beginning of something the painting didn't show, but made you certain was there. Donovan stood next to Marguerite and looked at it for a long time without speaking. "She was always mid-sentence," Marguerite said finally. "That was the thing I couldn't get right. She died before she finished things. Her work, conversations she was having, plans. I kept painting her as if she was stopped, but that's not what she was. Her voice was even. She was always in the middle." Donovan looked at the painting. "She's not stopped," he said. "She's about to move." "Yes." A pause. "That's exactly it." They stood in the quiet gallery, the finished painting between them and the November city outside, and Donovan thought that this moment, this specific, unscheduled, unprofessional, clarifying moment, was the most like himself he had felt in a very long time. "Marguerite, I want to say something. I haven't entirely worked out the phrasing. You have 18 years of boardrooms. Say it plainly." He looked at her. "I came into this gallery in October because I walked past the door and saw someone who knew exactly what she was looking for, even though she hadn't found it yet. And I kept coming back because I don't know how to do this carefully. I don't think carefully is the right approach here." He paused. "I think I'd like to keep showing up. Not for the gallery. For you." Marguerite looked at him with that full, considering attention, the look that evaluated rather than performed, that saw what it actually saw. "You," she said, "come with an extremely complicated company structure, a recent corporate sabotage attempt, and an ongoing inability to hang artwork without causing property damage. All true, and you're proposing to add a relationship to that. I'm proposing to be honest about what's already there. The almost smile appeared, the precise, considered one he had been cataloging since October. That's better phrasing than your opening, she said. It got cleaner as I went. Marguerite turned back to look at the finished painting of her mother. I've been alone with this for 12 years, she said. Trying to get it right. I know, I'm not looking for someone to fix anything. I'm not offering to fix anything. He looked at the painting, the woman in mid-sentence, mid-movement, full of what came next. I'm offering to be there while you work it out. The silence that followed was different from the silences that had come before. Warmer somehow, more certain of itself. Same cupcake tomorrow? He'd asked, in a different story. But this was its own story, and what Marguerite said was, the show opens Friday. I'm going to need help with the reception setup. I'll be here Thursday. I know you will. She glanced at him. Don't touch the hanging wires. Understood. She smiled. A real smile, the full version, the one he had been working toward since October without entirely realizing it. Go home, Donovan. Get some sleep. You just saved your company. We saved it. She turned back to her painting, and he looked at it one more time, and then he walked out into the November dark. He sent Callum a message on the way home. Fletcher's gone. Garrison's team will be hearing from legal next week. We're fine, Callum replied quickly. I should have seen it sooner. I'm sorry. We'll talk, Donovan sent back. Breakfast. Actual breakfast, not a briefing. He put his phone away and walked the last 2 blocks home in the quiet of the city. Past a bakery just opening its shutters. Past a man walking a large, entirely unbothered dog. Past the lit windows of the kind of ordinary life he'd spent 18 years moving too fast to look at directly. The November painting was on his kitchen wall when he got in. He stood in front of it for a moment before making tea. 6 months later, Marguerite Osei's show at a major Queen Street gallery was the most attended opening of the season. The unfinished painting, finished now, the one of her mother, was reviewed in the Globe as the most emotionally complete work to emerge from a Canadian artist in recent years, a study in the difference between an ending and a threshold. Donovan had bought it on the opening night. Marguerite had not given him a discount. He hadn't asked for one. The following spring, they were at his kitchen table, a table that had acquired, over the months, a particular quality of being a place where things got worked out. When Marguerite said, out of nowhere, I've been thinking about Vancouver, a show? Maybe. Or a residency. There's a program at Emily Carr that's been on my list for years. She looked at him steadily. It would be 6 months. When? September, potentially. Donovan set down his coffee. He thought about 18 years of being a machine, and what it had taken to stop, and what it had cost him to start again. I have an office in Vancouver, he said. I've been meaning to spend more time there. Marguerite looked at him. That's not a small adjustment. No, you're not adjusting your life around mine. I'm not adjusting anything. I'm telling you that the logistics are manageable if we want them to be. He met her eyes. Do we want them to be? She considered him for a moment in the particular way she considered things, entirely without performance, as if the question were a canvas she was deciding how to approach. Yes, she said, I think we do. Outside, Toronto was doing its spring thing. The ice off the lake, the trees in the annex putting out their tentative first leaves, the city easing back into itself after another long winter, with the specific unhurried optimism of a place that has survived this before and expects to again. Donovan looked at the woman across his kitchen table. Paint on her left wrist from the morning's work, coffee going cold beside her because she forgot it when she was thinking, entirely herself in every situation she entered, and felt, for the second time in his life, that he was exactly where he was supposed to be. The first time had been a rainy October afternoon in the doorway of a narrow gallery in the Distillery District, watching someone argue with a canvas. He hadn't walked past, he'd gone back. It turned out that was, improbably, exactly the right decision. What did you think of Donovan and Marguerite's story? Do you believe the best things find us when we stop running past them? Leave your answer in the comments. Rate this story from 0 to 10, and subscribe to Stunning Stories so you don't miss what's coming next.